شخصیت شناسی با دکتر جردن پیترسون. برای استفاده بهتر از این دوره پیشنهاد می‌کنیم که ابتدا تست شخصیت شناسی موجود در آدرس persianpeterson.com/neotest را انجام داده، سپس فایل PDFی که بعد از پایان تست دریافت می‌کنید و حاوی نتایج تحلیل شخصیت شماست رو دانلود و ذخیره کرده و در پایان دوره و بعد از دیدن ویدیوهای آموزشی سراغ آن بروید.
Personality. So why is it important for people to understand what personality is?
Well, you spend a tremendous amount of your time both to amuse yourself, to be engaged in life, and to do productive work-oriented activities, engaging with other people. And so you need to understand what they're like, and you need to understand what you're like, and people are actually quite different. And if you know what the differences are, you understand them better, and that means you can cooperate with them better, and you can compete with them better, and all of that's positive. Plus, it's intrinsically interesting. That's another advantage.
So when we think about personality, how much of it really is born, like when we pop out? How much of it is shaped, and when does it harden?
Well, there's a fair bit of the personality there at the beginning, even as early as newborns, and a fair bit of temperament is there in its nascent form by 6 months, and it's fairly stable. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean you can't learn new things. In some sense, you're born with a set of proto-skills and a proclivity to learn certain things easily, whereas other skills aren't there for you and you have to learn them with more difficulty. It's not like it's impossible. An introverted person can learn the social skills that come more naturally to an extrovert, but it's very effortful, and it requires a fair bit of exhaustion on the part of the introvert too, because they're not as naturally rewarded by the same social interactions. And a disagreeable person can learn the mechanics of caring for other people, but again, there's a fair bit of effort that goes into it. So you're set somewhere on a distribution of possibilities, and you can move it, but the more you want to move, the more effort it takes. So, and one of the upshots of that, I talk about this a bit in the course, is that knowing your personality is also useful with regards to such things as occupational choice, because you should really fit your personality. You should fit the job to your personality, right? So if you're extroverted, you might look for sales.
When you say that you can, with effort, tackle something that might not be naturally in your personality, is it better for people to gravitate toward their strengths of their personality?
It's definitely more straightforward, and I would recommend doing that, again, for occupational choice, and to some degree for mate choice as well. It's useful, I would say, to expand the limits of your personality. So if you're an agreeable person and you tend to take care of others and you have a natural proclivity in that direction, that doesn't mean it's not useful to learn the skills necessary to negotiate on your own behalf. So imagine that there's a distribution of personality on each trait, and you're sort of born at one point with some variation there.
Right.
Now, there's useful skills that can be had on the entire distribution, and so the broader you can make your personality, the more skills that you have at your disposal, then the more you can match your response to the specific demands of the situation. And that's really what you want. If you have a maximally flexible personality, it's like you can be agreeable when it's useful to be agreeable, and you can be disagreeable when it's useful to be disagreeable. And you're an extrovert, but you can learn to be silent when silence is actually the best strategy. So I would say part of what wisdom is that perhaps you accrue as you age is that your personality expands. The center point remains the same. So maybe you're still typically extroverted, but it expands so that, well, you can be an introvert when the situation requires it.
They're more strategic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and more situationally adaptive.
And sometimes it might seem a little counterintuitive, but you pointed out in the course that something like being disagreeable isn't always a negative. Sometimes it can be exactly the way you need to be.
It's very frequently a positive. I mean, you have to put your foot down, you have to stand for something, you have to be immovable at times, and you have to stand up for yourself and for the things that you believe in. And that means that you have to be willing to withstand a certain amount of interpersonal conflict.
Right.
And disagreeable people are definitely better at that.
When you mention like mate choice, what's the key when you're kind of looking at the personality of the person you're with? Is it the old opposites attract, or is it better to have similarity?
No, similarity is better. The only exception to that is probably on the neuroticism dimension. If you're high in neuroticism, you probably don't want a partner who's also high in neuroticism. That's too much. But the rest of it, like, it's hard for a real extrovert and a real introvert to get along, because the extrovert is going to want to be around people all the time, plan parties and tell jokes and be social, and the introvert is going to find that exhausting. And so, and then if you're, with regards to conscientiousness, like if you're a really orderly person and your partner's really disorderly, then that's going to be a constant source of conflict. Industriousness as well. If one of you is creative and the other isn't, you're not going to speak the same language. So I would say, and the evidence suggests this, is that similarity is better. That doesn't mean it has to be identical, but you don't want the gap to be so big that negotiation is impossible.
Right.
So,
when you talk about the traits that may be even seen at birth or 6 months, that's fascinating to all parents. You have a granddaughter.
Yep.
When you're looking at her, are you looking for things, clues, insights?
well, you see pretty early on, soothability is probably the most obvious one to begin with. Is like some babies are very, very calm, and they can tolerate a lot of transformation and change, and a lot of exposure to novel social situations and new people, and other babies are much more reactive and require a lot more soothing and care, and so that's something that's obvious pretty soon. After that, you get differences in positive emotion that show up. The degree to which the baby is socially engaging and likes to be around lots of people. And after that, then you start to see differences in the willingness to abide by rules and to show a certain amount of empathy. And that really starts to show up, I would say, between 2 and 4. So you can see this stuff pretty early. And, it's clear, I would say, that, and I think this is actually quite clear to parents who have a couple of children, is that they're quite shocked at how different their children actually are. It's also the case, I would say, that if your home environment is set up well, then your children end up in some ways maximally different from one another. Because you might say, well, because children are raised in the same family, there's going to be a fair bit of similarity between them. But a lot of that's not the case, because if you set your family up properly, then you have very individualized relationships with each person within the family, and that actually helps them capitalize on their temperamental distinctiveness. You have to be pretty tyrannical to end up with all your children the same,
right? Yeah,
given the innate variability in childhood temperament.
Right. Yeah. Well, my 5 are pretty different, so maybe I was not too much of a tyrant.
Well, you see the same thing happening on the sociological scale, is that in more egalitarian societies, there's more difference between men and women, because the egalitarian societies are actually less authoritarian, pretty much by definition. So what happens is people end up more different, is that their intrinsic differences are allowed to or encouraged to manifest themselves. And so if you could ally that with the ability to help people widen out their personality so they have a broader level of skills, then maybe you'd have an optimal situation.
So in this course where you dive into this can help parents understand their kids better.
Definitely. Well, I'd say that's especially true in combination with like a personality scale. We have one called the Big 5 Aspect Scale that's available online at understandmyself.com. And I'll tell you, I had my kids do that when they were teenagers. And I am reasonably expert in personality conceptualization. And I found things out about my kids that I didn't know, and also about my parents. And they found things out about each other.
Right.
And so I would say that's actually quite useful. Like, I found that I probably had a bit more fractious relationship with my daughter when she was a teenager. And I thought that she was acting in a rather disagreeable manner. But when we did the personality analysis of the kids, it turned out that my son was way more disagreeable than my daughter. But he was less neurotic. He was more emotionally stable. And so a lot of what looked like disagreeable behavior on her part that was causing conflict was actually anxiety. And so knowing that actually...
For understandable reasons.
Yeah, well, it also helped me respond to it differently because I became more patient, and it wasn't so much rebelliousness as it was just irritability and anxiety. And then with him, I thought, oh, I see, that explains something, because it was always difficult it was always a challenge to get my son to do anything he didn't want to do. Right. But he would deal with that with a smile and calmly, and so, you know, it took the edge of it off. But that was very helpful to learn that.
Well, it's insightful when you talk about them, but when you talk about them now, did they ever say, yeah, Dad, thanks for sharing that about me?
Oh, well, they're kind of accustomed to that. And so, and there's nothing about it that's particularly insulting, so that seems to work out all right.
But the key and kind of what you're looking at is, you know, there are probably tests that we take, and people take all kinds of tests, you know, Myers-Briggs and DISCs, and we know what Hogwarts house we're in and what Game of Thrones character we are. And I think millennials seem to be into the Enneagram and all of these things.
Yeah.
Why is the Big Five
different? Because it's valid.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we know that it's scientifically reliable test. All the other personality tests pale in comparison to the accuracy of, say, the Big Five aspect scale, certainly the Big Five, because we know the traits are separate, we know they're identifiable, we know that they exist cross-culturally, we know how they're related to all sorts of different forms of mental illness and health, we know how they predict job performance. We know their neurobiology to some degree, their underlying structures. So it's like, if you want to sort out elements, use the periodic table, because it's correct. You could use other mechanisms of sorting, but they're not going to give you accurate information. And so they're not all built the same way by any stretch of the imagination.
And you, as you mentioned, there are some things that you might not be surprised about. It's like, oh, well, I'm high in extroversion.
Yeah.
But I was like wildly high in openness to experience, which from my background or sensibility, I wasn't sure that I was like, wow, that's interesting. Or I was surprisingly low in politeness. I was like, really? So I think, isn't there a part of this where it's the things that surprise you about your personality?
Oh, definitely. And it isn't necessarily all pleasant news.
Right.
You know, like. Lots of people, for example, discover that they're very low in conscientiousness. And that's often, but not always, allied with being high in openness. And that's the liberal configuration, say. And there's some utility in that, because it makes you less rule-bound, and so it makes you more flexible in your choices. But it's hell if you're trying to implement something. I mean, so if you're low in conscientiousness, you're going to have to learn to use a scheduler like a calendar and to keep track of your time. And it's a real fight to discipline yourself. But you're going to pay a big price for it if you don't.
If you don't, yeah. Yeah, and you've obviously spent decades thinking deeply, seriously about everything in this course. What would you say is different about what people can learn in this course than they might find elsewhere online or in other courses?
Oh, they're going to get a much deeper understanding of what the personality traits are, conceptually, biologically, and also practically. And the course unites those levels of analysis. You know, so I try to provide a relatively complete description of what the traits are grounded in biologically, and what that means from an evolutionary perspective and from a biochemical perspective, and what the impact of that is politically and sociologically, and also in terms of your own life and understanding the world around you. And so, first of all, the information is accurate, scientifically grounded, but it's also extremely broad.
And you said a deeper understanding. There's some challenge in this course. You've got to be paying
definitely.
attention.
Yeah. You have to listen and pay attention, and it's fairly information rich, and it covers a very wide range of topics. And so And I think it'll provide people with plenty of food for thought. I mean, for example, the discussion on conscientiousness, I think, sheds really quite new light on what happened in Germany and during the Nazi period. And it's quite shocking, I would say. So that's all, there's a little bit of pain associated with that knowledge as well.
When you talk about the biology, the evolutionary history of personality, when you widen back and you look and you say, nature has kind of, created us with these distinct personality tendencies. It's in the same way I was thinking of it when you're like, it's kind of so odd that we can even dream. In a way, isn't it odd that we do have these personality tendencies at all, and that they seem to be complementary to each other in terms of we need all of them?
Yeah, well, it's a staggering thing to understand how different we are innately, and there's tremendous resistance to that idea, and even on the political front. I mean, that attitude is often described now by the people who are obsessed ideologically with the notion that we're only a consequence of our socialization. They call that biological essentialism and think about it as politically inappropriate. But it's not at all, because the other thing too is that the fact that you are a certain way gives you a certain intrinsic value and also a certain intrinsic dignity. Like you are a certain way. You can't even force yourself in some ways. You have to negotiate with yourself, and to know that people are the way they are, with some parameters for change, gives you some respect, I would say, for the diversity of opinion and perception that manifests itself in the world. Like, it's really incumbent on you, if you're a conservative, for example, to understand that there are unalienable advantages to a liberal perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that the liberal perspective is correct 100% of the time, but it's correct some of the time. Well, and so is the conservative perspective. And with, wildly creative people tend to have contempt for conventional people, and often the reverse is true too. And that's not helpful, because we need conventional people to keep the conventions in place, but we also need innovative people to make change when it's necessary. And that means that those two different types of people have to learn not only to put up with each other, but to appreciate the fact that those differences that can cause conflict actually exist. And so I would say that genuine understanding of the range of diversity and the depth of that diversity also brings about something that approximates genuine tolerance. And maybe the willingness to listen too. It's actually interesting once you understand how much people differ, to talk to someone who's temperamentally different than you are, because they don't see the world the same way. And if you listen, you might get some clues about what advantages their idiosyncratic or particular perceptual frame brings to that particular situation. And so it can really help you be motivated to listen, because you don't think so much, well, this person just disagrees with me, right? The facts are the same for everyone, and we're just having a disagreement. It's like, no, you're talking to a different being. The world manifests itself to them in a different way. And as I said, some of that's going to cause conflict. Some of it's going to be irritating because it rubs up against your own presuppositions. But it's also fascinating to know that you're actually talking to someone who is different than you.
And grappling with that makes us better.
Well, it certainly makes us better when we're trying to solve complex problems, because by definition, if you have a problem, then your knowledge and your temperamental proclivity isn't sufficient to have eradicated the problem. So you better be looking for sources that are other than sources of information that are other than what you have at hand. And they're often going to be generated by people who are thinking about this differently than you.
Right. Are there other misperceptions about personality that you see out there in the world? Is personality different than temperament and other terms that people use? Well,
all those terms tend to be loose enough so that there can be a substantial amount of overlap. And personality and temperament's more used, I would say, the connotation is more on the biological end. So your temperament is perhaps what's more, let's say it, hardwired. And your personality might be the mixture of your temperament with however your environment shapes you. Misapprehensions? Well, yeah, there are forms of personality variability that people talk about a lot that don't exist. Emotional intelligence is a good example. There's virtually no evidence for the independent utility of emotional intelligence as a concept. And I would say the same thing about self-esteem. Grit is another good example that's become very popular, but grit is merely a variant of conscientiousness, and the fact that it's been marketed as something different is actually not appropriate, I would say, from a strict scientific perspective. It's actually, it muddies up the water. Then there's all these different personality tests that are very popular, the Myers-Briggs being a good example, which is the most popular personality test. It's radically out of date. You know, it was made in the 1930s, far before we had the understanding of biology and motivation and emotion and brain function and the statistical techniques necessary to parse the personality traits out into their proper dimensions. And so it's not like all personality tests are created equal. And so that's another set of misapprehensions.
Right. And it seems like that argument, your argument has, you know, you're hearing that echoed. Adam Grant and others are big critics of Myers-Briggs and others, and so this is
the Myers-Briggs has no predictive validity with regards to job placement, for example, but it's used in corporate settings very, very frequently.
So when you think of the Big Five, when you think of this course, we've talked about the relationship of parents to their kids, a bit about the relationship with somebody you might date or a partner. How can this help leaders? How does it help in the workplace?
Well, one of the things that it can help you understand is who you should select for hiring. You know, if you're hiring managers and administrators, you want people with high cognitive power, and that's associated with openness to experience, intellect, and IQ. You want people with high cognitive power, especially as the job complexity increases. Low complexity jobs, which are ones that you can learn and then do by rote. They don't require so much general cognitive ability. But if you're hiring people to stay on top of a dynamically changing environment and they need to learn and make complex decisions, then you have to hire for general cognitive ability. And the difference economically between making the proper hiring decision and the improper hiring decision is overwhelming. It's going to make or break your enterprise. And then if you want managerial and administrative types, you also want to hire for conscientiousness. And so if you use an amalgam of general cognitive ability and conscientiousness, you can improve your hiring accuracy. Well, you can imagine your failure rate is 50%, in that 50% of the people that you hire are below average and 50% are above. It's just an arbitrary cutoff. If you use a decent selection process, then you can decrease your error in hiring by 50%. And so that will definitely make or break your business. And then if you also might need to hire entrepreneurial and creative types, depending on what they might be doing. But certainly you want an interleaving of entrepreneurial and creative types in your enterprise so that you have people who can think laterally, so that when the situation around you changes radically, you'll have people who can generate new ideas. And the managerial and administrative types aren't good at that. They're good at implementing what's already been formulated, right? If there's a forest and the trees, then the managers and administrators are focusing at the level of the trees. And the entrepreneurial types, the creative types, are focusing at the level of the forest. And they're going to be frustrating, the creative types, because they're not going to be great at detailed implementation. But you need to understand that it's not easy to find someone who brings all of the positive elements of all of the traits to bear simultaneously. You know, every time you pick a dimension along which you're going to select, you decrease the number of people who are qualified. Like, let's say you want someone who's real smart, top 10%. Well, you've eliminated 90% of your applicant pool. Then if you want someone who's in the top 10% of conscientiousness, you've eliminated 90% of your high cognitive applicant pool. And so you're down to 10% of 10%. You're down to 1 in 100 people with only 2 dimensions. Then if you also want someone who's extroverted, well, you're facing exactly the same problem. So what that means is you're not going to get everything in one person. You're going to need a diverse range of people.
And you extrapolate this out in the course in a really significant way, because you look at the failure of companies, even really large companies,
Yep.
and what that kind of catastrophic collapse can be because people don't understand.
Well, yes, and that's partly part of what's discussed in the course is the radical difference in productivity between individuals, and that's something that's, well, it's quite shocking to understand that that's the case, that in most enterprises it's a minority of people who are doing the majority of the productive work, and that, well, that you need to know that that's the case, that you need to hire to try to find more people like that, that you need to identify who those people are. And here's another thing that, like, managers often don't understand this. Say you have 10 people working for you, let's say you have 100 people working for you, and 5 of them are in trouble in one way or another, right? So they cause interpersonal trouble, or they're having a crisis in their life, or a series of ongoing crises in their life. The managers generally spend the most of their time with the employees that have the most amount of trouble. And that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do if you want to increase corporate productivity. Is what you do is you find your best employees and you spend all your time with them. So, and that isn't what people do, and it's economically counterproductive. It's partly because as a manager, you're not likely to be able to solve the problems of the people that you have who have problems. You just don't have the time or the expertise to manage it, generally speaking. Plus, it's extremely difficult. Now, that doesn't mean that if you run a company, you should ignore the people within your company that have or are causing problems. If they're causing problems, you might think about not having them. If they're having problems, well, then, you know, people are going to vary throughout their life in the degree to which they're having problems, and you want to set up your company so that there are support mechanisms in place for people who are in temporary crisis.
How do you answer the traditional question, are leaders born or made?
Well, it would depend on the kind of leader, I would say. There's a certain amount of born that's associated with it. I mean, a tremendous amount of the difference in general cognitive ability is genetic. You know, and no one likes that idea, but it doesn't matter. Well, it's especially the case as societies become richer and more egalitarian, because many of the sources that would produce differences in cognitive function get eradicated. I mean, 150 years ago, one of the reasons that there was huge variation between people in terms of intelligence was that some people got enough to eat and others didn't. And that made a huge difference, and that's still the case in many places in the world, especially early childhood developmental stunting because of low nutrition has permanent effects on cognitive function. That's pretty much gone in the Western world, and so you're left with biological variability. It's very hard to be a competent leader unless you're part of the so-called cognitive elite, you know, up in the top 10th percentile, 5th percentile, 1st percentile of cognitive function, because you have to be fast and sharp enough to be on the cutting edge.
So a final question or two. You've just finished over 100 cities that you've been lecturing to very large groups. This course you're with a smaller group. What's the dynamic of learning that is different in that kind of environment?
Well, generally the dynamic is that the larger courses are the larger audiences are more impersonal. I would say that the way I lecture, it actually doesn't make much difference, because even if I'm speaking to a large group, I'm always speaking to the individuals in the course. And what I would hope in this course is that people who are watching the material feel as if, have the experience that they're being communicated with directly. Because I'm not talking to the group ever, I'm talking to individuals. And so I think that's also what makes the material personally relevant. I have a kind of rule that I abide by with my lectures, which is, first of all, I'm always talking to individuals, but second, I try not to offer facts that are independent of their utility. I'm always thinking in the course and in my lectures in general, it's like, well, here's something that exists, here's a scientific fact, but you need a reason to grip it and use it, because scientific facts are actually tools, and this course is actually a toolkit for operating in the world, in your intimate relationships and in your business relationships. And so hopefully people will find that it's as if they're being offered a set of personalized tools.
And I think it would be accurate to say that it's kind of like a mini college class, and we're being invited into that classroom with you.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I would say that this course, which isn't that long, it's 5 hours in total, approximately. I would say that that's roughly the equivalent of a third to half of a fairly detailed university course on personality. Although I would say more than that. I would say that in this 5 hours, you will find more information than you would find in the typical full-scale one-semester personality course in university, because the information is very densely packed. So, I mean, in my personality course, I cover, at the university, I cover a tremendously wide range of fields and thinkers and topics, but there are many courses that concentrate, say, fundamentally on the big five and biological models, and so you get a pretty comprehensive view of that, overview of that in this course. And it's not, I didn't, what would you say? It isn't an unsophisticated introduction, right? You have to think your way through it. But I think that there's enough narrative scaffolding, there's enough of a story associated with each of the lectures so that it's, if you're concentrating and interested in the material, that you'll have no trouble following it. You might have to watch it more than once, but you should have no trouble following it.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Very nice talking with you.